I'm the headmaster of a grammar school. I'm the CEO and executive head teacher of an education trust. This is a multi-academy trust, which means that I run two schools at the moment. One's the grammar selective girls' school. I'm happy to pick up things about single-sex co-ed education as well, and also what's often called a secondary modern school. So secondary modern school is effectively a comprehensive, which is in close proximity to a selective school, which means all the bright students come to me, and that school manages everybody else that doesn't get into my school. So I run both of those. Adam, as he also introduced, deals with the earlier end of the education spectrum, so I'm going to gear around secondary first. I'm going to try and keep it a little bit to the areas that we had on the original plan, but they may not be the areas you're entirely interested in, so I'll skip over them fairly quickly. So one of the areas is around school places. One of the complexities about secondary schooling, and when I'm talking about secondary schooling here, it's 11 to 18. Some schools in the UK are 11 to 16, and then those students go on somewhere else at 16 to a sixth form college or a sixth form of another school. So secondary is the equivalent from the US point of view of high school, I suppose. And most schools are run that way. There are middle schools as well, but we won't get into those just now because it's complicated enough as it is. The other factor which I think we're going to pick up is the public-private bit. I'm going to leave Adam to do that one. So that's secondary schools. You have single-sex schools in that, so girls' schools, boys' schools. You have co-ed schools, which are both. You then have comprehensives and grammar schools. I'm going to roughly divide them into those. So a comprehensive education is where your secondary school has children from all abilities all together in the same school. They're not selected by their ability. A grammar school, by contrast, a selective school, has a test, and depending on the score of that test, that child comes to that school. The intention being to offer an education for those who are more able. And by doing that, then you do a particular type of education. I'll hopefully get into that a little bit more. What's worth knowing is there's just under 4,500 secondary schools in the UK. There's 163 grammar schools in that. So it's a tiny proportion. You wouldn't think so from the press, but it's a tiny proportion of grammar schools. There was a free tier system in the UK back in the 1950s. You had grammar schools, you then had basically technical schools, and you had secondary moderns. And the idea was everybody did the test, 11 plus, and they went to one of those according to their ability. The law changed over a period of time, largely over the 1970s into just the 1980s, and grammar schools then were banned, they were outlawed. So that no new grammar schools could be set up, and the existing grammar schools had to close. They had to either they became an independent school or they became a comprehensive. The difference being, in certain areas, parents were allowed to vote for what they wanted. On the basis of that vote, where those parents voted for grammar school, those grammar schools remained. And we're one of those 163 that the parents voted they wanted to keep. Currently, it's not possible to set up a new grammar school. It's illegal to do any kind of selection on entry to secondary schools. And this is the continuing debate which I find myself on the sharp edge of fairly frequently. And that's why there's so few. The other factor in that is they just exist in certain areas. There was no strategic plan on where these were going to be. It just depended on the parental vote, which means in some areas you've got lots of grammar schools, you're tripping over them, and in other areas you can't find one at all. So the where you live becomes really important for entry to a grammar school. And why that becomes really important is because one of the factors other than the test is your proximity to the school, how close you are. That has a whole level of complexity within it because it's not just distance, sometimes it's catchment area. You have to live in a particular location. Even if you might be further away, it's a particular location it draws from. That's what a catchment area is. Otherwise, it's distance, which could be straight line, which is fairly easy to understand but not so logical to implement. So for me, a straight line distance to my school would involve somebody travelling over the Thames. So they might physically be closer if they flew, but actually they have to go up the road and cross the ferry in Woolwich and come across and manage that. It takes them an extra hour potentially, but they are technically closer if they were flying. And at the moment I have no flying students, so it doesn't really apply. So you have a walking route or a driving route instead, which is mapped out. We've just gone to straight line from next year because of the complexity of measuring the route. It just became so complex to get that right, and there were so many potential errors in that we had to go for the simplest. Otherwise, I spend most of my time in appeals saying, actually, we live this close, not that close. So that's what happens with the selection bit, and that comes under oversubscription criteria, which means you have your test, your score, and then, depending, you've only got so many places, where do you sit on the oversubscription? So that school's oversubscribed. Most grammar schools are going to be oversubscribed by the nature of there's so few of them. And therefore, it starts with looked after child, which is the legal responsibility. So if a child is looked after, they're in care, then they get priority over everybody else. And that can't be changed. That's legally binding. Then it usually runs to something like siblings. So if they've got a sibling already in the school, and then it goes to distance. It does vary from school to school, but roughly it's in that area. And then there's various others underneath, but we'll just stick to those for simplicity for the moment. So how close you live and how well your child does in our selective test determines whether they get to the grammar school or not. If they don't get that, then their options are alternative independent sector perhaps, or to a non-selective school. And the quality of that non-selective school depends very much on where you are again. There's a wide range. Generally, pretty much every grammar school is either good or outstanding according to Ofsted. That said, some of those grammar schools haven't been inspected for over 10 years. So you have to take that with a pinch of salt in terms of the quality. But certain things will be really good. You would expect to have them there. But you also have very socially selective comprehensive schools. And it's socially selective because by virtue of where they are and who sends their children to them, it's almost the same as a grammar school or an independent school. Simply because it's populated by people of wealth anyway, because they live in that particular area. I'll give an example because I always like using this example. Is Holland Park School. So Holland Park School, although it does say it's got lots of disadvantaged students in it, actually spent thousands of pounds on Farrow Ball paints to redecorate it. That's not something my school would ever be able to do. It says something about the parental donations that go into that school to allow it to do that. So because of its location, it has fairly affluent, wealthy people live in it, and they send their children to that school. And there are other schools like that. Of the 100 most socially selective schools in the country, the majority are comprehensive, not grammars. There's only, I think, less than a third that are grammar schools in that. So it's not necessarily the case that grammars and comprehensives are a complete divide. There's a grey area in between where there's not much difference between them, to all intents and purposes. For you, as parents, and speaking to you as parents, one of the factors is to consider that whole admissions process. I could take ages on that, so I'm going to save that for questions instead. But the other factors within that are you do a test, you make your applications by the end of October, so we're in the midst of that now. Open sessions are in place. And then there's a gap between October and March, National Offers Day in March, where you get told whether you've got the school of your choice or not. And then it all starts moving anyway. Even if you think you've got the school of your choice, etc., then another school offers you, or you get a bursary for an independent school, and it starts moving. One person rejects an offer, another person moves up the waiting list. And in reality, it goes from March right up to September. I've had my latest change just today, and we're a few weeks into September. So although you might feel that making the choice and getting an offer is the end of it, it's not always the case. So it's worth bearing that long line in it. There's lots I could say on Ofsted, which I'll save that in case that's a question you have. In case if it isn't a question, I'm not going to bore you with Ofsted for too long. But I am an Ofsted inspector as well, so if you do have any questions around that, I'll bore you. So Ofsted, I think we did places, selective, non-selective. I think we've discussed that. Independent and public school, private school. I'm going to let Adam pick up on that a little bit more. And I think then the other areas were around university admissions and statistics and post-18. So if your children go through a school, they can then go into a sixth form in that school, and then they get their applications to university. In those universities in the UK, you have the top universities would be Oxbridge, and then the wider group are the Russell Group universities. Within that Russell Group universities, you have the 13 Sutton Trust universities, which are the top end of those. So they are the most successful universities, and usually they're research universities. So they get bigger grants because they've got research doctorates in them. And that's then the university admissions. Part of the factor in terms of choosing education is the likelihood of your child getting into the right university as well. And which sixth forms, which schools have a better success rate for getting children into a particular university. So one of the things to consider within that is actually what happens then, even though you might be just choosing secondary school or even primary school at this stage. What's the next stage in terms of university? Right, I think I've done a big overview. I'm going to give Adam a chance. Was there a question?
Yeah, very, very basic question. And apologize if I missed the first couple minutes. In terms of, if you're looking at it, the U.S. system, you enter K and there's 12 grades. How do primary, secondary schools roughly align with that in terms of how do age or grade level
My wife's American, so yeah, I'm happy to pick up on that because she's found the complexities of the system. So I'm head of a prep school, so my school runs from 3 to 11 years old. Kindergarten is essentially the entry level into school, so a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old depending on birthday. And then schools run till primary level, so that would be in the American system till K6. And then through from K7 to K12 is secondary school where Desmond works. So essentially you've got kindergarten to K6 and then you've got K7 through to 12. So we don't have the same sort of complexities of the elementary, middle and high school that most of the schools in America have. There are some sort of abstracts to that rule, as you'll find with everything in the British education system. But most schools are primary, secondary, with a few exceptions.
Yeah. And what age do they enter kindergarten? I'm just trying to figure out
Yeah.
also the gap year between university and...
So officially, compulsory education in the UK doesn't start till you're 5, so you can actually join in year 1. But most children, in fact, 99% of children join in reception. So that is when they are 4 years old. So 1st of September. When they are 4 years old, so theoretically they'll turn 5 at some point in the academic year. Increasingly, most people send their child to school from 3. So my child started prep school at the school I teach when she was 3 years old, and the academics are pretty structured actually. I mean, she's not even 4 yet. She writes her name. She's got a basic grasp of mathematics. Yeah, she's getting involved and preparing herself to be in the prep school, which is, I suppose, the complexities around the names of the system we're in. Shall I dive into some of the
I think that's a good
terminology with it?
point.
So I'm head of a prep school, which is slightly different to the idea of a primary or junior school. So state schools will call themselves primary schools or a junior school. We call ourselves prep schools because we are preparing children to go to the secondary level. And it's all a throwback really to the 17 and 1800s and people wanting to divide off who their children socialise with. And that brings you to the complexity then in the system of public schools versus state schools versus independent schools. Well, actually you have secondary schools that are funded by the state, and then you have public schools which are indeed independent and funded by the public, by your own purse. So these schools don't get any money from the state. So to attend my school, you are paying £15,000 per year. So that's the kind of key entry level on a prep school. Most prep schools in London run around £15,000 per year. You get them, a couple thousand less, a couple thousand more. But that's your going day fees for a prep school. We're over in Blackheath, so quite an interesting area in South London, very affluent, a lot of people who work in the city, and really just not enough guarantee around where you're going to send your child to state school. So in the Greenwich Borough alone, where I have my school, there are 99,000 school-aged children, and it becomes a lottery of what school your child will go to. And some of the schools are terrible. And some of the schools, as Desmond picked up on, have not been Ofsteded, so no one's had a critical look at them for over 10 years. In fact, the nearest state school to where I teach hasn't been Ofsteded for 13 years. It's one of the longest schools in the whole country since it's been looked at. So it makes for quite an interesting system. I think people are choosing a school like mine because they want a guarantee of where their child will go to school, but B, they want more of a bespoke education. So I would compare prep school and buying prep school is like when you buy a suit. You can either buy something from Savile Row that's going to cost you thousands and will fit beautifully and will feel nice and look right and be part of you, or you can buy something off the shelf, which is fine and it will do the job, but there's a fundamental difference between the education that's provided. Average class size at my school is 16. That's pretty normal for a prep school in London. 20 is generally the largest class size you'll find in a London prep. We actually scale that down for children when they're in their first year at the school. So we have classes of 12 for children when they join in reception. In that class they have a full-time teacher. Because we're very well resourced, we generally are paying teachers more than they would get in the state sector. So teachers are usually very highly educated. Most of our teachers went to top universities. We have quite an international mix, so UK, America, and some teachers from Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And then there's also a full-time teaching assistant in that classroom as well. And most of our teaching assistants have degrees also, and lots of them have PhDs. So we're looking at a classroom where your child's 5 and it's 1:6 ratio in the room with that child. Flip that to the state system, where many of the schools now, primary, are up to 36 children in that single classroom. I should say the average is 29, but 29 children in a room with 2 adults is your child getting lost. So you want to have that guarantee that you're getting a more bespoke, a more nurtured, a more stretched education. Of course I'm going to say this, I run a school where I need people to keep paying money, so it'd be no good if I told you the state sector was amazing. I mean, look, there's more to prep school than just obviously paying money and getting a small class. I would say if you choose prep school, you need to add on at least £2,000 a year for extras. I would say most of our parents run a bill of about £5,000 more for extras. What do I mean by that? Well, the uniform will set you back about £500 to kick off. We then run a series of clubs. Most children will join 3 or 4 clubs a week. So the more expensive clubs are horse riding, so that runs at £360 per half term. The cheaper clubs are, so my daughter, she's at my school, and she does Cookie Monsters on a Tuesday. That's £20 a half term and you bake cookies. So that's fine. Rugby on a Wednesday I think runs at about £80 a half term. Play ball as a multi-sport activity is about 120, so you add all that in. Equated on top of that is the fact you get 18 weeks holiday a year. I dare say you don't get 18 weeks holiday a year in your jobs. So then what do you do with your child? So our school is open 51 weeks of the year. We provide childcare from 7:45 to 6:30 in the evening through those 51 weeks. And there's all sorts of activities going on. So in the holidays we have holiday club, but it's not free, it's £200 a week. And that's minimum. So it's £200 a week for our basic model of arts and drama and music camps. If you want to do extra things on top of that, like we played netball at the Copper Box, we took the football team to Tottenham, we hired out the Charlton Athletic Stadium to play football. We sort of elevate things, but that obviously all comes at a cost, and the question is how much do you want to pay? How far are you willing to pay? And I suspect with your child, probably quite a long way is the answer to that. So it's something to bear in mind.
One of the topics that we brought in is how to get the best education without breaking the bank.
Yes, yes.
Is that possible?
Well, no, I have some tips actually. Let me bring up my notes on some tips on saving money.
Breaking the bank. My bank is different from yours.
Yeah.
Just trying to be, you know.
So I would suggest, yeah, if you've got a child, put aside for that 8 years of education, 120,000 is probably the amount you want to think about. If you're like me and you have a couple kids, you might want to start thinking about £250,000. And if you're like many of our families, I have several families with 4 children in the school, you're running at about £500,000. However, it's not all bad news, and you're not going to bankrupt yourselves, despite the fact, unless you buy a yacht, this is the most expensive thing you'll buy, less a house. Only 2/3 of people in the UK pay the full fee price. So 1/3 of people in the UK are not paying full fees, and the amount of money that people are saving is gradually increasing, and there are lots and lots of ways you can do that. The main two are scholarships or bursaries. So scholarships are something that are more readily handed out at secondary school level than they are at prep school level, although we have probably about 12 children on scholarships out of the 360. We won't give a scholarship to a child until they're 8, because the scholarship is for an exceptional talent. So it's either in academics, art, music, drama or sport. And secondary schools, or the independent secondary schools, will offer up to 50% off of your fees depending on how well your child performs, either in the entrance exam for the academic scholarship or as part of a sports day. If you want a sports scholarship, expect your child to be playing minimum county level sport. I would expect the child really to be pushing to an international level of sport to get a 50% remission on their fees. Academically, to get a 50% scholarship, you'll want your child in at least the top 10 children who sit that exam. The school I was at last year was a selective independent school up till 18. We had 410 children sit that exam, and that was for 50 places. So you're looking at about a 1 in 10 to 1 in 14 selection phase for these schools. Don't let that put you off though. There are other things in place. Bursaries are something that schools are increasingly handing out, so assessed on income. The schools are very secretive about what the number is of money that is the magic get-in. At my last school you had to earn under 40,000, and if you were under 40,000 and got the grades, it was free. Now a lot of schools, for example Girls' Day Trust schools, they go up to 75,000 household income and they'll reduce the fees, and some schools go up to £90,000 and will also reduce the fees. If you've got plenty of money in the bank, the best way to save money is to pay for the entire school all 7 years or all 8 years in one go, because then you're not paying for inflation and you're not paying for the school fee rise. And the school fee rise on average is 3.7% per year plus inflation. So a 4% rise per year over 8 years, you can save yourself a lot of money. I would estimate 40% of our parents are helped with their fees from grandparents. So if you've got rich grandparents with money that's sitting there, it's worth investing. I've had several parents, they will turn up on day one and they'll be like, can I pay 8 years school fees? And I'm like, absolutely. Because for me, that means the child is staying. You know, the other aspect is children move, and I don't want the child to move. I want them to keep paying the bills. So that's the sort of big fee saving tip at the moment. And with the political climate at the moment, VAT on fees, I don't know if you've sort of seen that with Labour, but I think in general VAT will go on school fees within the next 3 years, certainly, regardless of government. That's 20% on top of the fees for schools to absorb. That won't all be passed on to the parent. We're all planning for this. But what I'm saying is there's going to be a really big fee hike in the next few years. So if you can pay up front, the money's saved. Yeah?
What about options for children with disabilities?
Yeah.
Like your private school, is it accessible?
It would depend on, so certain learning needs, yes, but I mean we are not on that sort of end of the spectrum. There are certainly lots of schools for children with disabilities, whether physical or mental, that are independent schools and geared towards that. So a school probably 1.5 miles from me is called Riverston, and they are very much geared towards that field. What you'll find in independent schools is that they're very specific in what they can cater for, and parents buy into that very specific aspect.
On the broader state answer to that, state education, the local authority have a duty to provide an education for children with disabilities. If they can't access that within the current schools, they have to provide that access elsewhere, which sometimes could be an independent school, depending on the nature of the disability and the restrictions. Schools can't discriminate, state schools can't discriminate on disability when they do admissions. So unless it's something which is beyond the school's capabilities. So lots of old schools, our school, original building is 1937, has lots of little steps, and tiny little elevator, which was just for the premises team to bring stuff up and down. So we have a student who has a serious disability and is wheelchair bound, and we could make so many adjustments, but our big adjustment was re-timetabling the lessons so they were on the ground floor. So whatever class she's in, they're always going to be on the ground floor, so they save themselves all the steps because she gets the timetable for that. So yeah, we couldn't put a lift in for her because the building wouldn't allow for it, but there are other things that we can do. Some state schools will avoid doing that because it's a high cost and you never get anywhere near the funding you need to meet that cost. So that's where it changes quite significantly from one school to another. And for some schools, they would rather they didn't admit children with disabilities because they don't feel that they're going to be able to manage that over 5 or 7 years. But there are some very good state schools which really do a lot to accommodate that. And I think the thing is really what's the best fit for your child. What's the best school that can provide the best education and care for them, and go into the local authority to ensure that they take their duty seriously to provide that.
And what are the advantages or drawbacks of half private, half public schools? So starting primary and then moving to secondary, or the other way around. So, and is there difficulty to then change systems?
Well, this is something I'm seriously debating about my daughter. So I got to know Desmond through Townley Grammar, where I joined as a governor, and actually Townley is somewhere I'd really like my daughter to go one day. It's a great school and really well catered for, I think, for girls. My daughter's at prep school because the research suggests that actually the formative years of learning are the most important years of learning, and actually by the time you are 11, if you've been in a prep school, you can be 2 years ahead of your peers in terms of learning. And the reason for that is quite simple. I mean, we've got half the class size and 4 times the resources. A state primary school is funded at £4,700 of taxpayers' money. We're funding at almost £16,000. So we're able to do a lot more with the children, and that allows them to make the learning leaps. And a really big selling point of my school is that if you invest in our school for 8 years, you've got a really good chance of getting selected into a school like Desmond's. If you decide to go to a state school, you are narrowing your chances of getting into a grammar school, particularly where my school is based, because most of the children aren't automatically in the catchment for this grammar school. In terms of selection into an independent school without going to prep school, you need to be one of the top children in that state school to get in the independent school. Depending, there's a league table of independent schools, so the quality varies dramatically, but like the school I was teaching at last year, it's a top 100 highest performing independent school in the country. The state school children who joined found it a real challenge. It was a culture shock, the expectations, the rigour was hard, and even just as simple as the school day was an hour and a half longer than what they were used to. It becomes quite tricky. I think do you find a lot of people coming to sixth form from independent schools, or leaving to go to independent sixth form?
We get both. I mean, I would echo exactly what Adam said. If you were going to invest in one or the other, early years gives you the greatest dividend. Because it's those formative years, it does set the bar right. That's actually where the 11 plus test will take place, so preparation for that and primary school provision can be quite varied in the state sector. So it's a better investment in that, in terms of them being able to potentially access either a grammar school or a really good comprehensive school from that. And the next stage then is the sixth form bit, and sometimes that comes down to the curriculum offer that's available. So independent schools, some independent schools, there's a long line of independent schools going from Eton and Harrow down one end to a fairly tiny independent school. And lots of independent schools at the secondary level find it difficult to offer a wide enough A-level choice at sixth form. So that's why we do get a number that come to us, because we can offer, we have 25 different A-levels that we offer, all academic subjects. And for some independent schools, that's just not manageable at that end. So we get independent school pupils join us at sixth form level as well. So, and generally we get a fair number of admissions from prep schools to grammar. We try to keep it as balanced as possible by making sure that they don't get an undue advantage from that. But it's always there, it's always going to be a constant that there'll be the prep school. And for us in Bexley, The rule is if you're in the top 180, you get the top 180 scores out of the test, then you can choose wherever school you want, and regardless of distance. So you go to the front of the queue. Although we never have really high numbers in there, very often the ones that are there are prep school students who've got that. So it gives that advantage. You happen to live a bit further out and you're not entirely sure if you get the place, the score will. Having said that, other selective schools have rank order selection, which means they start from the top score and they work down until they're filled up. We don't do that in Bexley. The full grammars have one selective mark and then it's equal up until the top 180 when they get an advantage. But so it depends a little bit where you live and the rules within that. So sometimes the score you get is better. We've avoided doing that because we find it creates a degree of competition that isn't healthy in the secondary sector by them sort of comparing scores. And the most competitive is not the children, it's the parents around that, and publishing the scores of their children on social media just to rub it in if they haven't done it at the primary school gates. So we try to avoid that part. But depending on where you live, that might be the grammar schools. Next year they might have rank order selection, in which case preparation for that test and how they're doing that test means everything.
Can you talk a bit about single-sex versus co-ed schools, and also, again, I'm new to this, there's 11 plus for the girls, but 8 plus for the boys. What happens with the boys after that? How does it work?
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a co-ed school, so we have boys and girls at my school. Most prep schools are co-ed. You do get some that are single-sex, but they're starting to change quite dramatically. You'll find a large number of prep schools will accept children from 3, but then there are prep schools that will only accept children from 7 years old and 8 years old, so they have a 7+ exam. So just like there's an 11+ to get into the grammar schools, some of the prep schools will have a 7+ exam. So you need to find your child somewhere to go to school from 3 through to 6 years old. We lose probably 10% of our pupils a year to 7+ exams at competing schools, and then we find we have a transition of the other 10% to keep our numbers steady from state schools. There's a growing movement around a state till 8 concept, so parents deciding to save money for 4 years and then transition into prep schools. What I would say is then you can't guarantee your child a place. If you want a place at my school, really you need to join at 3. We usually have 5 or 6 places open up for reception places, but the other 54, 55 are filled by the children that joined when they were 3. There's then a 13+ system as well to confuse things further. So most schools accept children at 11+ age, but there are schools that accept at 13+. So Eton, Harrow, for example, are 13+ entry schools. So you need to find somewhere for your child to go until they're 12, and there are a variety of schools that cater for that. You've got a real mishmash, basically. You need to kind of have a view of where your child is going to secondary school. You need to really think, if your child wants to go to Eton, I would suggest go and have a look around Eton now. And start checking it out.
Have you got a boy or girl, or both? Both.
Yeah.
Okay, so the maxim really is, if you have a girl, send her to a girls' school. If you have a boy, send her to a co-ed school. Now, these are inconsistent arguments, clearly, because it won't quite work out that way. But the data, the evidence seems to suggest that girls do better in a single-sex environment, boys do better in a co-ed environment. And part of that experience tends to be that girls mature quicker, they therefore apply themselves quicker in general, and therefore they perform better along with other equally mature peers. Boys don't, and therefore human nature is to move to the lowest common denominator. So therefore girls are more likely to grade down to the boys than to grade up. What I find is I get significant numbers of boys coming to join the sixth form in our girls' school. We have a mixed sixth form, and I didn't think it was just because of the girls. Actually, they tend to come when we've surveyed them because they know they're going to work harder, because they're going to have competitive girls around them who are going to raise their game, and they know if they were in a boys' environment they wouldn't necessarily do that. So that, obviously each individual is an exception in their own. They might work very differently, and I have very hard-working, intelligent boys in the sixth form, and they tend to be the ones that have come to us, and I don't get the others. But yeah, that's been our experience, and there's a fair bit of research around that. Caroline Dweck is a psychologist. She's done a lot of work around women's and young girls' development, particularly around things like self-esteem and risk-taking, and how risk-averse girls can be. And sometimes you have to create an environment for girls to flourish in that. One of the factors clearly is a number of young women going into certain fields like physics and science. We have really high proportions who do computing and do physics and do science, and we wouldn't have those in a co-ed school because those girls would tend to fall back and allow the males in the class. In more realistic terms, what you tend to notice in the class, boys will blag it. So if they don't know the answer, they're going to have a go anyway, and they're going to stick their hand up and they don't care. The girls will want to go away, research it, find out the right answer, and come back with that next week with a 4-page sort of document or essay around that. And you want to find some middle ground. Occasionally it's good for the girls to blag it, and occasionally it's good for the boys to do some work. And that's what we find by bringing them together at sixth form, you get the best of both worlds.
Can I ask, maybe this is like kind of, I have a 17-month-old, and I'm really struggling to navigate what way to achievements. You say starting prep school at 3 years old, what do we need to do before getting to prep school?
Yeah.
I mean, everyone says when you're born, you've got to apply for certain things or live in support. I mean, that's the end of the life of the kid.
Yeah. I mean, I was having this conversation whilst we were having drinks, and really, I would say I have a parent interviewing tomorrow actually, and the child is due to be born via C-section on Thursday. I generally like to see the child, preferably. I would say typically the people I'm reliably giving offers to, that the child is around 2 to 2.5. And I'm expecting them to start within the next 6 to 9 months. I find the parents who interview earlier than that, I sort of get their £1,000 deposit, but then I don't necessarily ever see them again, because they probably put deposits down at 5-6 of the schools. So once you're at that kind of, you're heading towards the mark of 2 years old, go on open days, go have a look around the school, get a feel for it, and then go in for an interview with, usually the interviews with the head. Schools will either be selective or not. I am not academically selective at my school because I think it's crackers to believe you can select a 3 or 4-year-old based on their academic ability. I mean, if a child has an off day, if my child has an off day, I mean, no one in the world to take it. The interview is basically me deciding, is this parent someone I can put up with for 8 years? And the parent is deciding, is this where I want to spend over £100,000 of my money? And if the answer to both is yes, we have an agreement in place. If not, you go look elsewhere. The schools are so different. If someone doesn't want to come to my school having looked at it, that is fine. We are very different to the other schools in the area. We're set over old Georgian houses, right on the heath, whereas there's another school a mile down the road that's kind of round the corner and a bit out of the way, but it has a swimming pool and 6 rugby fields. So it depends what you're looking for, but don't be fooled by facilities because your fees are just paying for the roof fixing.
I would say on the age-free thing, there's some very good studies that suggest that everybody's a genius up until the age of 3.
Yeah.
So whatever testing you're doing with your children up to the age of 3, don't think that's it.
Yeah.
Everybody goes into decline from 3 years onwards, and then you get the real geniuses sometime after that. So don't predict too much on the basis of that. The only other thing I would ever say is also from the state sector on the interviews part, what state schools can't do is they cannot interview for places in their schools. There's an admissions code, it's legally binding, and it means that effectively you cannot interview for any place, whether it be at secondary or sixth form. Lots of schools do it illegally, and they call it a discussion, and they frequently get called out, and the admissions adjudicator will come in and will slap their wrists around doing that. The idea is you should only be admitted on the basis of the admissions criteria you have, not on an interview, which is effectively you judging whether you like them or not. Independent schools have a different system and they're not bound by that, and they can do that, but state schools can't. So, and I think some of the more socially selective state schools have tried to emulate an independent school admissions process, but they've sometimes done it illegally. So just be wary of that if you're called to an interview for a state school.
is it possible that the local authority will refuse any of the choices? I think there are 5 or 6.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, you get 6 choices. You're supposed to put them in order of preference. What the local authority does is called coordinated admissions. They will then look at all those choices, all those schools, and they will try and place all the first choice first. So if you really want a school, you really need to put it first. Obviously, if it's a selective school and your child hasn't been deemed selected, because in most authorities you've done a selective test before that decision's made. It's not always, but in ours it is. If you put a selective school, then that'll just be discounted as your first choice. So it won't get counted because you're not eligible for it at that point. So what they can do is they work from that, and they have to follow that order. That means as long as they follow that order and you've put them in the right order and those schools have places, you should be placed. What unfortunately happens because of limited places is you may be allocated a school which is further down your list than you wanted. It could even be it's not on your list because your list contained a group of schools which are not likely to be eligible for one reason or another. They're too far away, or they're selective schools and your child hasn't been deemed selective, and therefore the local authority will place you in what they consider the most suitable school, which may not be a suitable school at all. So you do have to think carefully about those choices. It's not just filling in boxes. Very rarely does it get down to number 6. Usually it's the first 3 choices for most local authorities, but most recently in the last few years there has been a significant problem in placing children, particularly in London. I think, I wrote a statistic down because I was shocked myself when I read it, that I think between 20 to 40% of families get their first preference in London. So depending where you are in London, you could be the 20% to get the first preference, which is not a high number at all. 40% maybe, that's still less than half get their first preference within that. Frequently, the other problem, because state schools are not now run by local authorities for the most part, they're academies, local authorities can't create more places. They could pressure me and say you need to open another form of entry because everyone wants to come to school, but they can't make me do it. And there's good reasons, because I might not be able to afford to do that. That means, therefore, they predict that the number of children coming through, the baby boomers coming through, and think actually when they reach this age they're all going to want a secondary school place. Have we got enough secondary school places? They might predict they're short of 500 places, but they have little power to do anything about that now. It requires an independent state school like mine to decide to set up another school, or to expand, or to set up a free school, which is it's supposed to be a parent-led free school, but usually it's done by other groups other than parents alone. But they're not done strategically. They're done by particular lobby groups. So you'll get a free school in a place where you don't really need it, just because the parents were powerful enough and smart enough to set it up and they wanted a certain type of school. And then 10 miles down the road, you don't have a school and you have all those places, but those parents weren't actually astute enough to know how to set up a school, so they didn't manage to do that. So there is a real problem in terms of school places and the size of schools. Grammar schools are generally small, usually around 5 form of entry. You're taking about sort of 30 pupils per form. Mine's 7 form of entry. It's one of the largest. It's got 1,500 students in it. That's quite unusual for a grammar school. But most of them are smaller than that, which means then competition for those places is more fierce. So school places is an issue, and it's worth keeping an eye on that as your child's sort of growing up, about, well, what are the places, what schools are opening up, where do I live, are there enough places for my child to get a place in that school? Independent schools have a lot more flexibility in that, in terms of their places to an extent. In the end it comes down to facilities and how many, but obviously a key thing for an independent school is keep the classes small, so you can't just cram them in. My classes are 32 in a grammar school. It's one of the highest performing grammar schools in the country. It hasn't made a difference to us, but we couldn't operate with smaller classes than that. Financially it wouldn't be viable, and that's how we get our funding. We get about £4,500 per pupil. You can compare that to the independent school fees. So we've got to teach that child, look after that child, do all the extracurricular, all the pastoral care, all the SEN needs for that £4,500. When again sixth form is only £4,000. So when they're doing A-levels, highly academic subjects, taught by highly experienced, well-qualified master's degree members of staff, you're getting less money than when they were in year 7 learning their geography or whatever it might be. So that hence class sizes become an issue, because it makes it more financially viable for a school to be able to keep running within that.
So supposedly, if you in the same in one area with some relationship between prep school and secondary school, like say if I live in North London and my kid studied prep school and if he wants to study in secondary school in South London, would that make him disadvantaged compared to someone who lives in South London?
Shall I pick up the state school bit first?
Yeah, no,
From
please do.
the prep school bit. So from the state school part, very few state secondary schools have feeder schools. There are some state schools that have a primary school as part of their wider school. So some of the larger multi-academy trusts run that, in which case it's expected that you go through into the secondary school. They don't always. And there are also some differences in faith schools. So for instance, Catholic schools, particularly in our area, won't enable students to do the 11 plus test because they want them to go to a Catholic school, not to the grammar school. So they won't let them do the test in the school, so they have to come to my school in order to do the test for that, because they want to actively discourage them from going to a grammar school, so they go to a Catholic school. So there are some schools that have feeders, and you will know that by looking at the school, whether it has a specific feeder primary or it has a run through of a primary through it. What I found from the state sector is where that is the case, the secondary part of that school works very hard to discourage the primary part from going to any other school other than their one. That's why they created it in the first place, to guarantee that intake. So they'll do all they can to prevent that, which means not releasing them for the 11 plus tests. So you have to sort of take them out anyway. It will mean taking them on school trips when all the open events are taking place, so they don't get a chance to go and see any of the other schools within it. There's a whole range of tactics that they'll employ to try and avoid that. Do you want to say something about the...
I mean, in independent schools, it's pretty straightforward. I would say that it doesn't matter. There really isn't. The relationships are there between the heads who are friends and are networked, but actually we're looking at the core score of how did that child do on the exam, and it doesn't matter where you've lived to do that.
In terms of the exam, is it the same if you're going into the state secondary or the independent sort of private secondary, or they're different exams?
So the exam system is a maze, basically. You end up doing a lot of exams. So they have, I'll let Desmond talk about the grammar exam, but independent schools almost all have their own exam. So I've seen children sit 9 exams, and all the exams are in January, and the exams, I mean, ours used to run at 4 hours. We'd have breaks in that, but it becomes quite pressurised. I recommend to the parents at my school that 3 is a sensible number, 4 would be a stretch. So I find most of my parents will try the grammar exam, whether they're anywhere near catchment or not, because it's good practice. I then tell them to have like a really desirable stretch school to go to, a couple realistic choices, and then a safety choice. So the children will probably sit 4 exams in January, and they vary to when they are, and then once they've passed the exam they'll then be interviewed as well. So you don't have a guarantee of a place even if you pass the exam, depending how popular the school is. Grammar school wise.
From the state sector, it's even more complex. All the tests are pretty well different. So there are 2 main test providers, GL Assessment and CEM, Centre for Education Monitoring. And they're the 2 big test providers in the UK for grammar schools. But there are lots of schools that run their own tests. They just write them themselves and they mark them themselves. And it's a very dubious practice because there's no objectivity within that. They're less and less now. So usually that GL or the Chem, as it's sometimes called, even those tests though vary. One of the reasons being that the test providers have to make those tests different because of test tourism. These are parents who basically transport their children from one place to another to do tests, and then feed that into tutors, and tutors then tutor people to know what's coming up on the test because they've done the test somewhere else. So I've actually seen one in another school, this is in Essex, where the tutors were in the car park when the test was finished to quiz the child that came out, so they can hop in their car, drive to the next test centre and inform the person they're tutoring of what was on the test. So a lot of measures are put in place to avoid the tests being too similar, to avoid that. But the basis of the test normally are a verbal reasoning, a non-verbal reasoning, maybe a reading comprehension and maths. The maths is always their primary school maths, what they've studied in their maths in primary school. Therefore, shouldn't make any difference whether they've had tuition or not. It's just how well they've done in their primary school. And if they've had some maths tuition, then fine. The verbal reasoning, again, it's vocabulary. It's sometimes links in with the reading comprehension. The more reading they do, the better it is. Far more than just learning vocabulary, because it's in context. The non-verbal reasoning is the one which is significantly different for children, because this is looking at a series of shapes and diagrams and matching out what's the missing one, what's next within that. And they don't do that in primary school. And that's where potentially most of the tuition or the materials are used in terms of getting them used to that kind of thinking. And it's about their thinking process. The rest of it really doesn't require a significant amount of tuition. And there's a difference between tuition and familiarization. Familiarization is getting them used to doing that kind of thing, a test which is timed and in a particular environment, and knowing what the questions work like. And with ours, it's an OMR reader. I don't know if you know of those things, but you've got colouring the little, like the lottery, and you've got colouring a little bit, and getting them used to just doing that properly. And they're the familiarization parts. The tuition parts are really the specifically sometimes coaching, which is tutoring them to actually do certain types of things in certain types of ways. So sequencing types of questions, learning what those sequences are and how to sort of figure out what the next sequence would be through practice on that. And then there's actual tuition in terms of their literacy and their maths, which is you would possibly do during primary school anyway at some point, particularly if they were struggling. But there is an unregulated and quite vibrant tuition fraternity out there, which makes a lot of money from tutoring children and preying a little bit on the anxieties of parents around that. You have to be very careful to navigate those. Some of them don't know what they're doing. Some of them know what they're doing, but they can be quite unscrupulous around it. But they will tell you that you need it, and in most cases, really, you don't.
You don't need tutoring. I would avoid tutoring. I don't think you need it. Your child. If you tutor your child too much, they'll get into the wrong school, and then they'll struggle through 7 years of secondary school. You want your child to get in the appropriate school for their ability, so I would avoid tutoring. What I would say is a prep school, unlike a primary school, is we do prepare the children for verbal and non-verbal reasoning, so we are practicing and tailoring to these exams, because obviously it's not on the national curriculum, because most people, only 7% of people in the country are sending their child to this kind of school. But obviously, if you come to a prep school, all of our children go to either an independent or a grammar school. So we need to make sure the children are ready for that. And I think that's worth sort of segueing to the fact that when we were talking about the cost of prep schools, a lot of the things that we include within our fees, you would be paying extra for if you send your child to a state school. So for example, the clubs, although we ask for a cost for them, they are still cheaper than racing around Saturday and Sunday on your weekends around London trying to take your children to all these clubs. You're not having to spend as much money on tutoring because we're providing that on site. Regardless of where you send your child to school, they're going to have a lot of holidays and you're going to have to pay for them to go somewhere. So it's better for them to be at their school where they know everyone than at some random centre where there's no control over who they're with. But something to keep in mind.
We have time for maybe 2 more. So.
Yeah, you mentioned national curriculum. So is this, I've never understood, is it like is it a guidance from the government, or like, so do schools have to follow it, or is it, how much flexibility is there in terms of shaping what the students learn? Because I learned from one mum potentially homeschooling that you don't have to like follow it at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's become a bit of a dark art, the national curriculum, because academy schools don't have to follow the national curriculum anymore, and I think 75% of schools are now academies at secondary level. So it's a guidance, and I think most schools still follow large aspects of it. So even as a prep school, we look at it quite closely, because someone's put more thought into the national curriculum than anyone's put into any other curriculum that's out there. So it's actually guidance that's useful. I suppose we have a bit more freedom around topics in geography, for example, in history, and texts we study in English. But with maths, for example, we follow it very, very closely, because we know that the schools are selecting and using the teaching up to year 5 for their exams. So if you start teaching year 9 maths to a year 5 student, that's great, but that stuff's not on the exam and it's not going to help them in the immediate future. So there's flexibility around it.
From an Ofsted point of view, Ofsted now, when they go into schools under a new inspection framework, they need to know from that school, if they're not teaching the national curriculum, why, and what have they put instead, and what's their rationale. If they've got a good reason for it, great, but if not, they should be using the national curriculum. So they have to have thought through why they've got a curriculum as it is. So currently at our school, we've been decolonising the curriculum for our English literature. That means sort of looking at the literature that's in there, that students are studying, and making sure that it's not been overtly influenced by a British Empire and a colonial makeup. So that actually we have a very diverse school population. It's ensuring that they're getting writers from all over the world within that, not just ones who are pale male and largely dead as well. So we've been doing that. That takes us away a little bit from the national curriculum, but we have a good rationale for doing so. And it fits for our school community as well.
What is it that you guys are looking for when you are rating school?
Right.
What is the difference between an outstanding or a good and an outstanding that was rated in 2007 versus a good that was rated last year?
Yeah.
And
Can I add briefly just first that independent schools generally are not Ofsteded. So we have a separate board. So when you look at independent schools, you will see they have a rating from ISI, the Independent Schools Inspectorate, and we work on a slightly different model. You're either excellent, good, sound, whatever that means, or terrible.
Needs improvement.
Yeah. So, but most schools are excellent or good because of the way the system works.
They tend to be the same inspectors. You can, as an inspector, you can train to do the independent schools bit, so they come from the same body. There isn't an easy answer to this because there's a new framework, which means that everything's different now. From September, every inspection is different to previous inspections. The bar keeps shifting. It has tended to go up. So an outstanding 9 years ago has no relevance to an outstanding now. In fact, outstanding now, the word commonly being used by Ofsted is exceptional. And I've gone through it and I'm an outstanding school and it's a tough bar to reach. And I seriously know in so many schools which are outstanding, which weren't inspected for 10 years or so, they would not meet that bar on my knowledge of them. So I think you're going to expect to see a lot less outstanding schools in the next few years as a result of that. So it does vary, but generally now it's about the quality of education, which is the curriculum. How is the curriculum chosen? Why this curriculum? Why in this order? And how are they learning that? And how are you making sure they learn that? And how do they learn, remember things, and are able to recall them in different contexts? Attitudes and behaviour. So how do the students behave? What's their attitude to school? Things like attendance, punctuality indicate that. What's their attitude to learning within that, and what's the school done to develop it? Personal development. What goes beyond their normal curriculum that develops them as a person? So their social skills, their understanding of British values, etc. And then leadership and management. How well led is the school? Is the school management, and that includes governors, thinking about that school, where it's going, what it needs to do and address within that. So it's those categories now that rate that school. The big difference, which is really important to you, is now when a school's inspected, the letter goes to you as a parent. It's written for you, not for the school or the head teachers or anybody else. That means it's also written in a language which is going to be accessible to most parents as possible. Hasn't quite gone to emojis, but it has been simplified a lot, and there's a lot less education speak in it. But the purpose is that it's for parents, the Ofsted inspection, not for anybody else.
Why are some schools not being evaluated by Ofsted for 10 years? What determines when a school gets evaluated?
Okay, so this is partly it's law. So the law was passed that said that outstanding schools are exempt from inspections. So now Ofsted legally can't inspect a school which had an outstanding judgment.
How long?
For how long?
Forever, or until Ofsted changes or the law changes. However, there are exceptions. So if there's a safeguarding issue, if something happens in that school or it's a complaint, Ofsted can go in and inspect regardless. If there is a significant fall in standards, so they do a risk assessment, and if the results have bottomed out, then they can go in and inspect them for that. And they do what's called a Section 8 inspection, which then they judge there needs a full inspection after that, and they come in and do that. It's quite rare, but they are starting now to do those for outstanding schools. So the law really has to change for that, for them to come back in. The other real issue why sometimes schools haven't been inspected is simply there are not enough Ofsted inspectors to cover the amount of schools that need to be inspected. So, and most of those Ofsted inspectors now, a fair amount, are serving practitioners like me, which means I'm not available to do inspections that often because I'm doing other stuff like running a school. So I have to keep rejecting inspection calls, and I don't get to do as many as another inspector would do. The advantage of it means when I inspect, I understand how a school runs and operates, and therefore I'm making a fair judgment for that school as well, rather than not having been in a school for 10 years and then going in and judging it. But you would expect now, depending on the age of your children, that over the next few years, it's all changing. It's a much better inspection framework than I've ever seen in 30 years of education. So for parents in particular, I think this is the most powerful Ofsted inspection framework for you. So you could read a lot into that. But I would be careful, look at the dates of the Ofsted inspection for the schools you're looking at. And if it's more than a few years old, it's more than 5 or 6 years old, then don't read too much into it. It might be fine, but you want to see if that's still true or not, rather than just base it on the badge. Schools are legally required to put the date of that Ofsted inspection when they put the Ofsted judgment up. They don't, they mask that out. But Ofsted requires them to put the date when they put it up there. So if they don't show the date, ask for the date of the inspection. It'll be on their website. They're also legally required to show their Ofsted inspection on their website.